Jake was running out of options. His rent was due in 2 weeks, and his bank account looked sadder than a wilted houseplant. Living in downtown Portland wasn't cheap, especially when you're a freelance graphic designer whose biggest client just decided they could make their own logos using free apps. He sat on his worn couch, laptop balanced on his knees, typing up yet another roommate ad on Craigslist. This was his 5th attempt this week. The previous ads had attracted some interesting characters, like the guy who wanted to turn the living room into a meditation center for his pet iguana, or the woman who insisted on conducting all conversations through interpretive dance. Okay, let's try this again, Jake muttered to himself, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Responsible graphic designer seeks roommate to share spacious 2-bedroom apartment. Must be clean, quiet, and normal. Please, just be normal. He hit post and immediately regretted adding that last part. Nothing good ever came from begging the universe for normalcy. Within minutes, his phone buzzed with a new email. Jake nearly spilled his coffee when he saw the response time. Either this person had incredible timing, or they were desperately refreshing Craigslist like some kind of apartment hunting robot. The email was from someone named Zara. Short, sweet, and slightly odd. Hello, Jake. I am very interested in your living space. I can pay 3 months in advance with cash. I have some questions about human social interactions and typical responses to romantic gestures. When can we meet? Jake read it 3 times. The money part sounded amazing, but the questions were weird. Maybe she was writing a book or doing research for college. He met plenty of quirky students in Portland. Besides, 3 months up front meant he could actually sleep at night, instead of calculating how to survive on ramen noodles and hope. He replied quickly, setting up a meeting for the next afternoon. The next day, Jake spent 20 minutes cleaning the apartment and another 10 trying to make it look like he wasn't desperately broke. He hid the stack of unpaid bills under a magazine and strategically placed his one nice coffee mug where it could be seen. When the doorbell rang, Jake opened it to find the most striking person he'd ever seen in real life. Zara was tall, with perfect posture and features that looked like they'd been designed by someone who'd studied human beauty and decided to create the ideal version. Her dark hair was sleek, her clothes looked expensive, and her eyes seemed to take in every detail of his face like she was memorizing it. Hello, Jake, she said, extending her hand for a handshake that lasted exactly 3 seconds. I'm Zara. Thank you for meeting with me. There was something formal about the way she spoke, like English wasn't her first language, though she didn't have any accent he could identify. Come on in, Jake said, stepping aside. Can I get you some water? Or coffee? Water would be acceptable, she replied, then immediately pulled out a small notebook and wrote something down. Jake paused halfway to the kitchen. Did you just take notes on my hospitality offer? Zara looked up, her pen frozen midair. I'm conducting research on social interactions. Your offer of refreshment is a common human bonding ritual, correct? I guess. I just thought you might be thirsty. More scribbling in the notebook. Jake was starting to wonder if she was some kind of sociology student doing extreme field research. He showed her around the apartment, explaining the rent, utilities, and house rules. Zara asked surprisingly detailed questions about his daily routine, what time he went to bed, how often he had visitors, and whether he typically engaged in what she called courtship behaviors in the shared spaces. Courtship behaviors? Jake asked. Dating activities, romantic interactions, bringing potential mates to the residence for bonding purposes. Jake couldn't help but laugh. You make it sound like a nature documentary. But no, I'm not exactly fighting off crowds of potential mates these days. Zara made another note. Excellent. That will not interfere with my research parameters. The weird comments kept coming. When Jake mentioned he sometimes worked late, Zara asked if this was normal human productivity behavior or if he was compensating for inadequate daytime performance. When he showed her the kitchen, she wanted to know if he prepared traditional mating foods or if his cooking skills were below average for his demographic. Despite the odd questions, there was something fascinating about her. She listened intently to every word he said, Like his answers were the most important things she'd ever heard. Plus, she really did have 3 months' rent in cash, which she counted out on his coffee table in crisp hundreds. I have one final question, Zara said as they wrapped up the tour. What are your responses to various forms of physical attraction displays? For instance, if a female were to wear clothing designed to emphasize certain physical attributes, how would you typically react? Jake felt his face heat up. That's kind of a personal question, don't you think? I'm gathering data on normal human responses. Your reactions would be very valuable for my research. What kind of research are you doing exactly? For the first time since she'd arrived, Zara seemed uncertain. I'm studying human romantic behaviors and emotional responses for my thesis. Yes, my thesis project. Jake wasn't entirely convinced. But the money was real, and honestly, living with a quirky grad student beat living under a bridge. Okay, well, as long as your research doesn't involve turning our apartment into some kind of weird social experiment, I assure you, my methods are purely observational. That night, after Zara had officially moved in with just her single metallic suitcase, Jake lay in bed listening to strange humming sounds coming from her room. Not singing, exactly, but a low, electronic kind of hum that seemed to pulse in regular intervals. He also realized he hadn't seen her eat anything all day, despite offering to order pizza. When he'd asked if she had dietary restrictions, she'd said she had very specific nutritional requirements and would handle her own meals. Around midnight, he got up for water and noticed a soft blue light under her door. Maybe she was one of those people who slept with special lamps. Portland attracted all kinds of alternative lifestyle folks. But as he passed her door, he heard something that made him stop cold. Zara was talking to someone, but it didn't sound like a phone call. Her voice had a different quality, almost like she was speaking through some kind of electronic device. And the sounds coming back weren't quite human. Jake pressed his ear closer to the door, trying to make out words. But it was like listening to a conversation between a computer and a radio. Lots of beeping, static-like sounds. And Zara's voice saying things like research subject shows normal parameters and romantic behavioral patterns within expected ranges for target species. Target species? What kind of thesis project was she working on? Jake crept back to his room, mind racing. Maybe she was doing some kind of advanced psychology research with special equipment. Or maybe she was just really into high-tech stuff. Portland was full of tech workers who turned everything into data points. But as he drifted off to sleep, one phrase kept echoing in his head, target species. That was a weird way to talk about humans. Almost like she wasn't one herself. Jake shook his head and buried his face in his pillow. 3 months of rent, he reminded himself. Whatever weird research project his new roommate was working on, it was funding his ability to keep a roof over his head. He could deal with a few quirky habits and strange late-night phone calls. After all, how weird could it really get? Jake woke up the next morning to the smell of something burning and what sounded like a smoke detector having a nervous breakdown. He stumbled out of bed and rushed to the kitchen, where he found Zara standing over the stove, holding a pan that was producing impressive amounts of black smoke. Everything okay in here? Jake asked, opening windows and fanning the air. Zara turned to him with the most serious expression he'd ever seen someone wear while holding a smoking pan. I am attempting to create what your internet refers to as breakfast in bed, as a gesture of domestic partnership appreciation. However, the molecular structure of these egg proteins is not responding as predicted. Jake looked at the pan, which contained what might have once been eggs but now looked like charcoal sculptures. Have you ever cooked eggs before? I have extensively researched the process. The instructions seemed straightforward. She consulted her ever-present notebook. Apply heat to protein until transformation is complete. I may have miscalculated the thermal requirements, right? Jake said, gently taking the pan from her. How about I show you? Cooking is kind of like chemistry, but with more improvisation and less precision, as he demonstrated proper egg cooking technique. Zara took detailed notes on everything from the heat setting to the way he moved the spatula. She asked questions like, is the circular motion of your stirring implement significant to the bonding process? And would you rate this domestic activity as romantically appealing? Zara, you don't have to analyze everything like it's a science experiment, Jake said, plating the eggs. Sometimes people just cook because they're hungry. But surely there are social implications to food preparation, particularly when performed for another individual. Jake paused, spatula in hand. She wasn't wrong. There was something intimate about cooking for someone else. But the way she talked about it made it sound like she was studying alien behavior. Over the next few days, Zara's research became more obvious and increasingly elaborate. She started appearing in different outfits each morning, then asking Jake to rate their visual appeal factor on a scale of 1 to 10. When he protested that rating people's appearance was weird, she explained it was for her thesis on aesthetic preferences in human mate selection. I'm not looking for a mate, Jake said, trying not to notice how the blue dress she was wearing matched her eyes perfectly. But, hypothetically, if you were, would this color combination increase or decrease my attractiveness rating? The honest answer was that she looked stunning, but admitting that felt like falling into some kind of trap. I think you look nice, but maybe ask someone else? I'm not really qualified to judge these things. Zara made a note, subject to Flex Direct aesthetic evaluation. Possible cultural conditioning against verbal appreciation of female appearance. Could you maybe not call me subject? When I'm standing right here, of course, Jake deflects direct. Aesthetic evaluation. It wasn't much better. The experiments escalated from there. Zara began practicing what she called casual physical contact initialization by finding reasons to brush against his arm or shoulder, then immediately asking how the contact made him feel on both physical and emotional levels. It's just a normal touch, Jake would say, trying to ignore the way his heart sped up. But did it produce any involuntary responses? Increased heart rate, elevated skin temperature, desire for additional contact? The worst part was that it did produce those responses, and Zara seemed to know it. She had this way of studying his face that made him feel like she could read every thought. One evening, Jake came home from a client meeting to find his living room transformed into what looked like a romantic movie set. The lights were dimmed, candles were lit everywhere, and soft jazz was playing from a speaker system he didn't even know they had. Zara appeared from the kitchen wearing a dress he'd never seen before, carrying 2 glasses of wine. I am testing the effectiveness of atmospheric manipulation on human emotional responses. Please sit and tell me your immediate reactions to this environment. Zara, this is. Jake looked around at the candles, the music, the way the soft lighting made everything look dreamy. This is really nice. But you can't just set up romantic scenarios and expect me to give you scientific feedback. Why? Not, you are experiencing emotional responses. Correct. Your pupils are dilated, your breathing has changed, and you have been standing in the doorway for 47 seconds without moving. She wasn't wrong. The whole setup was affecting him, but not just because of the ambience. It was watching her try so hard to understand something that should be natural. There was something both heartbreaking and endearing about her scientific approach to romance. Come on, Jake said, accepting the wine glass. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. You can't just copy what you see in movies. Real romance is about connection, not just setting and props. Connection, Zara repeated, writing in her notebook. Please elaborate on the specific mechanisms of human romantic connection. Jake sat down on the couch, and Zara immediately positioned herself at what she probably thought was the optimal distance for conversation. It's not really about mechanisms. It's about getting to know someone. Sharing things about yourself. Being vulnerable. Vulnerable, she said, testing the word. This means revealing weaknesses that could be exploited. Not exploited. Trusted. It means letting someone see the parts of you that aren't perfect, and trusting them not to hurt you because of it. Zara was quiet for a long moment, staring at her notebook, and this creates romantic attachment, sometimes. If the other person is vulnerable too, and you like what you see, what would you need to see in me to feel this romantic attachment? The question caught Jake off guard. She'd asked it so directly, like she was requesting technical specifications. But there was something in her expression that seemed genuinely curious, almost hopeful. "I'd need to know who you really are," Jake said. "Not the researcher or the thesis student, but you. What makes you happy? What are you afraid of? What do you dream about?" Zara looked down at her hands. "Those are very personal questions." "That's the point. Romance requires personal." She was quiet again, and Jake could almost see her processing this information. Finally, she looked up at him with those incredibly direct eyes. "I dream about understanding," she said slowly, "about finding a place where I belong. And I am afraid that I am too different from everyone else to ever truly connect with another being." It was the most human thing Jake had heard her say, and it hit him right in the chest. Without thinking, he reached over and touched her hand. "You're not that different," he said. "Everyone wants to belong somewhere." Zara stared down at their joined hands like she was studying a fascinating specimen. "Your heart rate increased again, and your skin temperature. Are these positive responses to emotional vulnerability?" Jake couldn't help but laugh. "You just shared something beautiful and personal, and you're still taking notes. Should I not be? This is valuable data about human bonding processes. Maybe try experiencing it instead of studying it." Zara looked confused. "I do not understand the difference." That's when Jake realized that for all her research and careful observation, Zara might not actually know how to feel things the way other people did. Her scientific approach wasn't just academic curiosity. It might be the only way she knew how to navigate emotions. "Here," Jake said, not letting go of her hand. "Close your eyes and stop thinking about research for 60 seconds. Just notice what's happening right now. But how will I record the data? Trust me. Just try it." Zara looked skeptical but closed her eyes. Jake watched her face relax slightly, her breathing slow down. For the first time since he met her, she looked peaceful instead of intensely focused. "What do you notice?" Jake asked softly. "Your hand is warm," she said, eyes still closed. "And I can hear your breathing. The candles smell like vanilla, and the music has a rhythm that matches." She opened her eyes suddenly. "That matches the current rate of my cardiac function. See, you don't always need to analyze everything. Sometimes you can just experience it." Zara looked at him with something that might have been wonder. This is how humans process romantic scenarios, through direct sensory experience rather than analytical assessment. Sometimes the best things can't be measured or categorized. They just have to be felt. For a moment, Jake thought she might actually be getting it. Then she picked up her notebook and started writing furiously. "This is fascinating data about the relationship between sensory input and emotional response. The subject demonstrated significant physiological changes when encouraged to engage in experiential, rather than analytical processing." Jake sighed and leaned back on the couch. Living with Zara was like being roommates with a beautiful, brilliant alien who was trying to understand humanity through field research, which he was starting to suspect might not be that far from the truth. 2 weeks into living with Zara, Jake started keeping a mental list of things that didn't quite add up. She never seemed to sleep, but she was always energetic in the morning. She claimed to eat, but he never saw any food in the refrigerator. That belonged to her, and sometimes, when she thought he wasn't looking, she would stare at everyday objects like she was seeing them for the first time. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when Jake woke up to find Zara standing in the middle of the living room, perfectly still, with her eyes closed and her face turned toward the ceiling. "Zara, you okay?" Her eyes snapped open immediately. "Good morning, Jake. I was conducting atmospheric analysis. Checking air quality, temperature variations, humidity levels, standard morning routine." Jake looked around. The perfectly normal living room. With what equipment? Zara paused for just a moment too long. "Internal sensors. Personal assessment. Using my senses." That afternoon, Jake decided to do some investigating of his own. While Zara was out on what she called field research, he took a closer look around the apartment. Her room was always locked, but she'd left some of her research materials in the living room. Her notebook was filled with observations that got stranger the more he read. Subject shows typical human attachment to inefficient caffeine delivery systems. Daily grooming rituals appeared to serve social signaling rather than practical hygiene purposes. Emotional responses to visual entertainment suggest complex psychological patterns. Unique to this species. Jake flipped through more pages, finding detailed charts about his sleeping patterns, eating habits, and something labeled romantic response indicators with timestamps and measurements he didn't understand. The really weird part was a section titled Integration Challenges. That included notes like maintaining physical form requires more energy than anticipated, and translator occasionally defaults to technical terminology. Physical form, translator? Jake was so absorbed in the notebook that he didn't hear Zara come home until she was standing right behind him. That information is confidential, she said, her voice strangely flat. Jake spun around, clutching the notebook. Zara, what is this? What kind of research are you really doing? I told you. My thesis project on human romantic behaviors. Then why do you keep referring to humans as this species like you're not one yourself? Zara went very still. That is academic terminology. It creates scientific distance from the subjects being studied. And what about maintaining physical form? What does that mean? You are misinterpreting my notes. Jake stood up, the notebook still in his hands. Am I? Because I've been watching you, Zara. And nothing about you makes sense. You don't eat food I can see. You don't sleep. You ask questions like you've never interacted with humans before. And sometimes. He paused, remembering something that had been bothering him. Sometimes when light hits your eyes, they reflect like an animal's. Your imagination is creating patterns where none exist. Then explain this, Jake said, flipping to a page covered in symbols that definitely weren't any human language. What language is this? Zara looked at the page and her whole demeanor changed. The careful, controlled expression she always wore cracked, and for a second, Jake saw something that looked like panic. That is, a personal code I developed for note-taking efficiency. Jake stared at her, all the weird little details suddenly clicking into place. The way she studied human behavior like it was foreign to her. The strange equipment humming in her room. The late-night conversations and electronic beeping sounds. You're not human, are you? The words hung in the air between them. Zara's face went through a series of expressions, surprise, calculation, something that might have been relief, and finally, resignation. That is an illogical conclusion based on insufficient evidence, she said. But her voice lacked its usual conviction. Is it? Because it would explain everything. The research, the questions, the way you talk about humans like you're studying us from the outside. Zara was quiet for a long moment, and Jake could practically see her weighing options in her head. Finally, she walked to the window and looked out at the city. What would you do, she said slowly, if I told you that you were correct? Jake's heart started pounding. He'd been half convinced he was losing his mind. But hearing her almost admission made it real. I don't know. I guess I'd want to know why you're here and what you want from me. Zara turned back to face him, and something in her expression had changed. She looked tired, which was strange because he'd never seen her look tired before. I'm what you would call an anthropologist, she said. My people sent me to study human civilization, specifically your romantic and social bonding behaviors. You were selected as a research subject because your demographic and lifestyle made you an ideal candidate for close observation. Jake sat down heavily on the couch. So this whole roommate thing was just so you could study me like a lab rat? Initially, yes. And the romance research, the questions about attraction and relationships? My mission was to understand how humans form emotional and romantic attachments, to learn what drives your bonding behaviors and how they affect your social structures. Jake felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. So everything, the experiments, the questions, even asking me to help you understand romance, that was all just data collection. Zara was quiet for a moment. It was supposed to be. What do you mean, supposed to be? She walked closer, and Jake noticed that she moved differently when she wasn't trying to appear human. More fluid, more graceful. Like gravity affected her just a little bit less, something unexpected happened during my research. Zara said, I began to experience the phenomena I was supposed to be studying objectively. What phenomena? Emotional attachment, personal investment in your well-being, desire for your approval and companionship. What you would call, she paused, like, the word was difficult, affection. Jake stared at her. You're saying you developed feelings for me while you were studying me? I am saying that prolonged exposure to human emotional patterns appears to have created similar patterns in my own neural responses. It was not supposed to be possible. Because you're not human? Because my species does not experience emotions the way yours does. We form social bonds based on logic, compatibility, and mutual benefit. We do not have what you call romantic love. Jake's head was spinning. But you do now? Zara looked directly at him with those two bright eyes. I do not know what I have. Now, I only know that the thought of completing my research and returning to my people causes what I can only describe as distress. And the thought of never seeing you again creates a response pattern. That disrupts my normal cognitive functions. That sounds like feelings to me, yes? Zara said quietly, I believe it does. Jake stood up and started pacing. Okay, so let me get this straight. You're an alien anthropologist who came here to study human romance, but ended up falling for your research subject. That is a crude but essentially accurate summary. And your people, do they know about this emotional development? Zara's expression darkened. They are beginning to suspect that my objectivity has been compromised. They have been requesting more frequent reports and expressing concern about my extended timeline. What happens if they find out? I do not know. This situation has never occurred before in our recorded history. Jake stopped pacing and looked at her. Really looked at her. She was still the most beautiful person he'd ever seen. But now he could see the otherworldly quality that he'd been unconsciously noting. The way she held herself, the intensity of her focus, the slight luminescence to her skin in certain light. What do you really look like? He asked. Zara hesitated. Would you like to see? Jake's mouth went dry. Can you do that? Just change? The form I wear now requires constant energy to maintain. It would actually be easier to show you my natural appearance. Jake nodded, not trusting his voice. Zara closed her eyes, and the air around her seemed to shimmer slightly. Her height increased by several inches, her skin took on a subtle luminescent quality, and her eyes became larger and more intensely colored. She was still recognizably herself, but clearly not human. This is who I really am, she said. And her voice had a musical quality that hadn't been there before. Jake stared at her, trying to process what he was seeing. She was beautiful in a way that was completely otherworldly, like looking at a piece of living art. You're incredible, he said finally. Zara's expression shifted to surprise. You are not afraid. Should I be? Most humans would be frightened by physical evidence of non-human intelligence. Jake walked closer to her, studying her transformed features. Maybe. But you're still you, aren't you? You're still the person who burns eggs and asks me to rate romantic atmospheric conditions. Something that might have been relief crossed her face. Yes, I am still that person. Then I'm not afraid. Confused, maybe. A little overwhelmed. But not afraid. Zara shifted back to her human appearance, the change rippling across her like water. Jake, there is something else you should know. More revelations? I'm not sure my brain can handle much more tonight. My people will eventually come for me. And when they do, I will have to make a choice. Jake felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The next few weeks felt like living in a beautiful dream that could shatter at any moment. Jake found himself studying Zara the way she had once studied him, trying to memorize every detail before it might all disappear. She was different now, that the truth was out, more relaxed, more herself. She still took notes sometimes, but now it seemed more like genuine curiosity than clinical research. When she laughed at his jokes, it felt real instead of calculated. When she touched his hand while they watched movies, he could feel the warmth of actual affection instead of scientific experimentation. But there were constant reminders that their situation was temporary. Zara's communication device, which looked like a smooth, silver disc, would pulse with soft light at random times throughout the day. Each time it happened, she would grow tense and distant, speaking in those electronic tones to whoever was on the other end. My supervisors are growing impatient, she told Jake one morning after a particularly long conversation with the device. They want me to submit my final report and return for debriefing. Jake was making coffee, trying to act normal even though his stomach twisted every time she mentioned leaving. What are you telling them? That I need more time to complete comprehensive analysis, that human romantic behaviors are more complex than initially anticipated. She paused, watching him measure coffee grounds with unnecessary precision. I am not telling them about the emotional complications. What would happen if you did? Zara was quiet for a moment. They would assume I had been compromised and order immediate extraction. They might also decide that I am no longer suitable for anthropological work. Jake turned to face her. And what would that mean for you? I would likely be reassigned to a different field of study, something with less potential for personal involvement. Her voice was carefully neutral, but Jake could see the worry in her eyes. And us, there would be no us. I would be forbidden from returning to Earth. The coffee maker gurgled in the silence that followed. Jake realized he'd been holding onto hope that maybe her people would understand that love could transcend species differences. But it sounded like Zara's civilization viewed emotions as a weakness rather than a strength. How much time do we have? Jake asked, unknown, but probably not long. That afternoon, Jake made a decision. If their time was limited, he wasn't going to waste it worrying about the future. He was going to show Zara what human love really looked like, not as a research subject, but as someone who deserved to experience it fully. He started small. Instead of letting her analyze his responses to romantic gestures, he began making gestures of his own. He brought her coffee in the morning without being asked. He learned to cook her favorite human foods, which turned out to be anything with chocolate. He introduced her to his friends, carefully explaining that she was a foreign exchange student studying American culture. Watching Zara interact with other humans was fascinating and heartbreaking at the same time. She was so careful, so precise in her responses, like she was afraid of saying the wrong thing and revealing herself. But gradually, she began to relax. She laughed at David's terrible jokes. She asked Lisa genuine questions about her job. She even joined in when they played board games. Though she had an unfair advantage at anything involving strategy, your friends are kind. Zara said later that night as they walked home from game night. They accepted me without question. That's what good people do, Jake said. They don't care where you come from or what makes you different. They care about who you are. Zara stopped walking and looked at him. Is that how you feel about me? Jake took her hand, not caring that they were standing in the middle of a busy sidewalk. I fell for you before I knew what you were. Finding out you're not human doesn't change how I feel. If anything, it makes you more amazing. Even though I deceived you were doing your job. And you told me the truth when it mattered. Zara's eyes got that bright, intense look they had when she was processing something important. Your capacity for forgiveness is remarkable. My people would consider such trust to be a weakness, maybe. That's why they don't understand love. You can't have real love without trust and forgiveness. And you believe what we have is real love. Jake stopped walking entirely. They were standing under a street light, and the soft glow made Zara look ethereal and beautiful and completely present all at the same time. I know it is, Jake said. At least for me. Zara was quiet for a long moment, studying his face in that intense way of hers. I need to tell you something, she said finally. My emotional responses to you have been affecting my physiology in ways I did not expect. What do you mean? When I am near you, my energy patterns synchronize with yours. When you are happy, I feel what I can only describe as lightness. When you are sad or worried, I experience corresponding distress. It is as if my neural pathways have adapted to mirror your emotional states. Jake felt his heart skip. That sounds like more than just studying human emotions. Yes, I believe I am experiencing what your species calls being in love, she said. The words carefully, like she was testing how they felt. Is that correct? Jake couldn't help but smile, even when she was confessing her feelings. Zara approached it like a research question. Yeah, that sounds right. How does it feel? Terrifying. Wonderful. Completely illogical. She paused, like something I never want to lose. Jake stepped closer to her, close enough that he could see the slight luminescence in her skin that she couldn't quite hide. Then don't lose it. It may not be my choice. My people. Jake kissed her before she could finish the sentence. It was supposed to be gentle, reassuring, but the moment their lips met, something electric passed between them. Zara made a soft sound of surprise, then kissed him back with an intensity that made his knees weak. When they finally broke apart, Zara was staring at him with wide eyes. That was different from your research? Jake asked, slightly breathless. That was nothing like research at all. They walked home in comfortable silence, hands intertwined. But Jake could feel the weight of unspoken worries between them. How long could they pretend that her people wouldn't eventually come for her? How long could Zara keep making excuses for her delayed report? The answer came sooner than either of them expected. 3 days later, Jake woke up to find Zara sitting on the edge of the bed, her communication device pulsing with urgent red light instead of its usual soft blue. What's wrong? Jake asked, immediately alert. They know, Zara said quietly. Somehow, they know that my objectivity has been compromised. Jake felt ice form in his stomach. How? I am not certain. Perhaps my recent reports have been too favorable toward human emotional capacity. Perhaps they have been monitoring my biometric data and noticed the changes. She looked at him with eyes that held so much sorrow for someone who claimed not to understand emotions. They are sending an extraction team. When? 48 hours. Jake sat up, his mind racing. Can you refuse to go? I can try, but that would mean choosing exile for my people forever. I would never be able to return home, never see my family again, never be part of my civilization. And if you go, Zara's voice was barely a whisper, then this ends. They will likely erase my memories of this experience to prevent future compromise. I will return to who I was before I met you. Jake felt like the world was collapsing around him. So either you lose your family and your whole world, or you lose me and forget this ever happened. Yes, they sat in the pre-dawn darkness, holding each other while the impossible weight of the choice ahead settled over them. Jake had always known this moment would come, but knowing it and facing it were completely different things. What do you want to do? Jake asked finally. Zara was quiet for so long that he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but sad. I want to experience every moment we have left, and then I want to make the choice that will cause the least pain for both of us. Jake's heart broke a little, because he was pretty sure. He knew which choice that would be, but he also knew that love sometimes meant letting go, even when every part of you wanted to hold on forever. Okay, he said, pulling her closer. Then let's make these 48 hours count. The next day passed like a fever dream. Jake called in sick to work, and they spent the morning doing perfectly ordinary things that felt extraordinary, because they might be the last time. They made breakfast together, with Zara finally mastering the art of not burning eggs. They watched bad movies on the couch, with Zara providing commentary about human storytelling techniques. That made Jake laugh despite everything. But underneath the normalcy, Jake could feel time ticking away like a bomb countdown. That evening, Zara's communication device started pulsing more frequently each time it activated. She would step away to have increasingly tense conversations. In her electronic language, Jake couldn't understand the words, but he could hear the urgency in the responses coming through the device. They have arrived in your solar system, Zara told him after the latest call. They will be here by tomorrow evening. Jake was washing dishes, focusing on the simple task to keep his hands from shaking. Have you decided what you're going to tell them? I have been thinking about what you said, about trust and forgiveness being necessary for love. Jake turned off the water and faced her. And my people do not understand these concepts. They believe that emotional attachment makes individuals weak and unpredictable. If I return with them, I will be expected to view my time here as a period of temporary malfunction that has been corrected. But that's not how you see it. No. Zara moved closer to him, and Jake noticed that she wasn't bothering to maintain her completely human appearance anymore. There was a subtle glow to her skin, and her eyes held depths that seemed almost infinite. I see it as the first time I have truly been alive. Jake felt his chest tighten. Sarah, I have made my decision. Jake, I am going to stay. The words hit him like a physical blow. No, you can't do that. Sarah looked confused. But I thought this was what you wanted. Not like this. Not if it means you lose everything else that matters to you. You matter to me. I know. But so does your family, your home, your entire civilization. Jake took her hands, trying to ignore how perfectly they fit in his. I can't let you sacrifice all of that for me. It would not be a sacrifice. It would be a choice. A choice you might regret someday. Sarah was quiet for a moment, studying his face with that intense focus. He'd grown to love. You are trying to protect me from making a decision that could cause me pain. Yes. Even though that decision would allow us to be together. Yes, this is love, isn't it? Wanting someone else's happiness more than your own? Jake felt tears prick his eyes. Yeah, this is love. Sarah reached up and touched his face gently. Then you should know that staying with you would make me happier than returning to a life where I never learn what happiness means. But your family will survive without me, and perhaps someday, if I prove that emotional attachment makes individuals stronger rather than weaker, they might understand. Jake wanted to argue more, wanted to convince her to go back to her people where she belonged. But looking into her eyes, he saw the same determination she'd shown when studying human romance. Except now she was studying the possibility of a different kind of life entirely. Are you sure? He asked. I have never been more certain of anything. The next evening, they waited together on the apartment building's roof. Sarah had explained that her people would expect her to meet them in an open area, away from human observation. The city lights spread out below them, and Jake tried to memorize the way Sarah looked standing against the night sky, luminous and otherworldly and completely perfect. They will try to convince me to return, Sarah said. They may even try to force me. What will you tell them? The truth. That I have learned something here that I cannot learn anywhere else. That love is not a weakness to be corrected, but a strength to be celebrated. A soft humming sound filled the air, growing louder by the second. Jake looked up to see lights approaching from the north, moving in patterns that defied everything he knew about aircraft. They're here, Sarah said unnecessarily. The ship, because it was clearly a ship, even though it looked nothing like the science fiction movies, settled silently onto the roof about 50 feet away. It was beautiful in an alien way, all smooth curves and soft light that seemed to come from within the material itself. 3 figures emerged from the ship. They looked like Zara's natural form, tall and luminescent, but somehow more formal, more distant. They approached with purposeful strides, and Jake could feel the weight of their attention even from a distance. The leader spoke to Zara in their electronic language, and Jake heard her respond in the same tones. Even without understanding the words, he could tell it was a formal conversation, official. After several minutes, Zara turned to him. They want to know if you coerce me in any way, if you use manipulation or force to influence my decision. What did you tell them? That you tried to convince me to go with them, that you put my well-being above your own desires. She smiled slightly. They find this behavior confusing. The conversation continued, growing more intense. Jake watched Zara's body language become more defensive, more determined. The other beings seemed to be growing frustrated, their posture becoming more rigid. Finally, Zara said something that made all 3 of them go very still. The silence stretched out until Jake began to worry something had gone seriously wrong. The leader approached Jake directly, stopping just a few feet away. When it spoke, the words came out in perfect, accented English. You are the human who has disrupted our researchers' objectivity. Jake straightened his shoulders, trying not to be intimidated by the being's otherworldly presence. I'm the human who fell in love with her, and she fell in love with me. Love is not a concept our species recognizes as valid. Maybe that's something you should study instead of just dismissing it. The being tilted its head, considering Jake with eyes that held depths he couldn't fathom. You believe this emotional attachment has value? I know it does. It makes us stronger, braver, more willing to sacrifice for something bigger than ourselves. Yet you encourage our researcher to abandon her mission and her people. How is this sacrifice? Jake looked over at Zara, who was watching the conversation with tense attention. I didn't encourage her to stay. I tried to convince her to go. With you, because I love her enough to want her to be happy, even if it means losing her. This seemed to surprise the being. It turned to Zara and spoke in their language. She responded at length, gesturing toward Jake several times. When the conversation ended, the being faced Jake again. Our researcher has presented an interesting hypothesis. She believes that emotional attachment, when properly understood, could enhance rather than compromise our research capabilities. Jake blinked. She wants to study love scientifically. She proposes a long-term anthropological project, examining the effects of emotional bonds on individual and social development. She believes she is uniquely qualified to conduct this research. Having experienced both perspectives, Jake looked at Zara, who was trying to hide a smile. You want to stay and study love as your official job. I want to build a life with you, Zara said, but I also want to bridge the gap between our peoples, to show them that emotions are not weaknesses to be feared, but strengths to be understood. The leader looked between them for a long moment. This proposal has merit. We will allow a trial period, 5 Earth years to compile comprehensive data on human emotional bonding and its effects on cognitive and social development. Jake felt his heart leap. 5 years, if the research proves valuable. The assignment may be extended indefinitely. The being paused. However, this is contingent on both parties' continued cooperation and the researcher's ability to maintain objectivity while experiencing emotional attachment. Zara stepped forward. I accept these terms. The being nodded and turned back to Jake. Do you understand that you will essentially be a permanent research subject? Jake looked at Zara, who was glowing slightly brighter with what he was learning to recognize as excitement. Will I get to help with the research? Your participation would be essential. Jake grinned. Then I guess I'm okay with being studied for the next 5 years, as long as the researcher doesn't burn my breakfast anymore. Zara laughed, a sound that had become more musical and less calculated over the past few weeks. I believe I can manage that. The beings returned to their ship with formal goodbyes and promises of quarterly check-ins. As the craft disappeared into the night sky, Jake and Zara stood together on the roof, watching the stars. So, Jake said, putting his arm around her, how does it feel to be the first alien anthropologist to study love from the inside? Terrifying, wonderful, completely illogical. She leaned into him, solid and warm and real. Like something I never want to lose. You won't lose it. We've got 5 years to prove that love makes the universe better, not worse. Zara looked up at him with eyes that held starlight and infinite possibility. And after 5 years? Jake kissed her forehead, tasting the faint luminescence that she no longer tried to hide. After 5 years, we'll have forever to figure out what comes next. 6 months later, Jake's apartment had been transformed into something that was part home, part research laboratory, and part love nest. Zara's official reports to her people were filled with detailed observation.